Okay, we are nearly at our limit, so good afternoon to those that have joined. Um, Please take note of the information in the Q&A. That is only for questions to the speaker. Please do not post your email addresses. We will be taking attendance through the system itself, and we'll be able to pick up who is online and who is not. So we're now at over 1,000 people. So we'll begin the session for this afternoon. Today we have a very important speaker, Ms. Moliehi Makumane. She is a specialist in international cybersecurity. She is a researcher with the Security and Technology Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Her expertise spans international cybersecurity, with a particular emphasis on emerging technologies and how it impacts security within developing countries. Before UNIDIA, she was South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperations representative, where she led the international cybersecurity um, area as a negotiator for the UN Open-Ended Working Group, as well as a senior advisor in the UN Group of Governmental Experts. She's also worked on the Intergovernmental Expert Group on Cybercrime. She holds an honors degree in political and international studies from Rhodes University. For those who have heard her speak before, you'll know she's very, very passionate in this area, and it promises to be a brilliant lecture. Today, she's talking on state responsibility in cybersecurity. So Moliehi, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brett, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much to Brett and colleagues and the Southern African Netherlands Cybersecurity School for inviting me here to make this presentation. I have got a slide deck. Brett, tell me if you see it.
I can see the window, but the slides are not up yet.
Okay. Let's see.
Okay, we're seeing the main window again.
Still just window.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see.
Okay, now the slides are up.
Okay. You see everything properly now?
Yes, it looks like it. We're seeing scenario one, critical infrastructure.
Okay. Do you see the first slide now?
No, we
But
see the
possibly,
window for PowerPoint.
I think I possibly have, I see what's happening. I've got multiple ones open now. Let me just shut everything down and start, because this is what you should be seeing. Let me start it over. Do you see what I see now?
We see your PowerPoint window.
Still
Okay, perfect. Full slides now.
full
There is
slides now. Okay.
yeah, there is a slight delay between what we see and what pops up on the window sometimes.
Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, so now I'll start. Okay, fantastic. So today I'll be presenting on state responsibility in cybersecurity. And I will start by let's have some reflections. So at this point, you would have already discussed the fast evolving cybersecurity landscape and are aware of the concerns that cybersecurity professionals all over the world are concerned with, ranging from ransomware, phishing still remains a problem, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and how they are making cybersecurity incidents propagate and scale at rapid paces. So what we are concerned with here is cybersecurity in the context of state relations. And what this means is that there are several roles that countries play even in cybersecurity, because countries are responsible for passing legislation as well as policy on a wide range of things. This is also an area in which they're very active. Some academics have even referred to cyberspace as a domain of war similar to land, air, water. But some have also looked at it as that cyberspace is also an area where states or countries are able to also use very strategically. So this is a spectrum of country or state involvement. For the duration of my briefing, I'll be referring to it as states, because within the United Nations, we refer to member states of the UN. So because there are so many actors in the cybersecurity space that can be seen as perpetrators of malicious incidents, we first have to understand what the role of the state is there so that it rises to the threshold of being referred to as state responsibility and state behavior. So you might have an incident where a cybersecurity or a malicious actor is operating within a particular country. It is the responsibility of that country to treat that perpetrator as a crime if it is a crime within that jurisdiction. If that state fails to do so, but is aware of those activities, we may refer to it as state tolerated. And then you have activities by other perpetrators where you might find that the state actually encourages this kind of behavior that would fall in that particular part of state involvement. But then as you go further to my left, to my right, then you see there is state assisted, state coordinated, state directed. And this is where it gets really tricky, as well as state executed, where we find that there are countries that either through their national security apparatus, maybe their equivalent of state security, intelligence agencies, or even their law enforcement agencies, actually coordinate these malicious incidents. And the target here is also just as important. They would be targeting these incidents towards other countries. And there could be a myriad of motivations or motives for this. You'll know as we talk about the taxonomy of cybersecurity, there could be various motives. Some actors act for financial gain, some act for political gain. And this is where state-assisted, coordinated, directed, and executed malicious ICT incidents usually fall. And this is important to know because states are not like regular people. And so there isn't a court where you can say you will take the state if it is found to have performed in this particular way. And it's also very difficult to draw a straight line between a particular perpetrator as well as a state. But what instead the UN has done, because of the devastating effects of these malicious ICT incidents against the infrastructure of other countries, member states of the UN agreed to responsible behavior. And by responsible behavior, they meant that they would not put moratoriums on particular ICT tools, and they wouldn't regulate those ICT tools either. But rather, states are encouraged to behave in a way that shows respect for each other, but also respect for international law, respect for the UN Charter. And so that is what member states have agreed to. There is no enforcement body for this, but rather, as member states continue to discuss what this behavior looks like, responsibility, then members increasingly making sure or trying to ensure that their strategic activities within the cyber domain do not harm the critical infrastructure of other countries. This particular area of international cyber policy is diplomatically complex. As I said, it is not easy to attribute a cyber incident to a particular country, regardless of the headlines and what may seem to be happening. But rather, it is recommended that these particular incidents are resolved in a diplomatic manner in order to preserve international peace and security. Of course, they are very technology driven, and so as the technology improves, countries do procure the technology and are developing particular cyber capabilities that they use for strategic purposes. But again, there's the challenge, as with any technology, it is widely available. And so even capabilities that countries had developed for themselves to be used just by their particular institutions have fallen in the wrong hands, and therefore been procured by cyber criminals or even terrorist groups. And so it is very, very difficult. But all in all, to say that cyberspace, as it applies to countries or states, is not the Wild West. There are responsible rules of behavior that member states have agreed to, and there is also international law that applies to the conduct of states. And so to demonstrate this, I've prepared 3 scenarios which could happen anywhere in the world. Some probably already have, but the point here is to then see, as we go through these scenarios, how a policymaker who's looking at international ICT security would then read the scenario. So the first one is an attack on critical infrastructure. And here, the energy grid of a country has been targeted. This is not a fictional scenario. There have been incidents against energy grids of countries, water, telecommunications, and the like. And so here what we see is that an adversarial group aimed to disrupt the national energy grid by introducing an AI-powered malware into the system. The malware is designed to analyze the target infrastructure's vulnerabilities, adapt to behavior, evade detection. The AI-powered malware is harder to detect, as it is also capable of exploiting vulnerabilities that are still unknown without human intervention. The consequence of this, disruption of the energy grid, economic loss, and societal breakdown. And the big challenge here is that critical infrastructure has been targeted and the malware is adapting very quickly. What member states have agreed to, and this falls under these responsible behavior norms that they have adopted, is that number one, countries have a responsibility to protect their national critical infrastructure. And so if a country believes that the energy grid is part of their national critical infrastructure, it should be designated as well as properly identified, most likely in the national cybersecurity strategies or in the national cybersecurity frameworks. Whatever the country uses, critical infrastructure has to be designated, and transparency measures have to be taken to ensure that other countries know that for country X, that is critical infrastructure. But then there's also an expectation on member states to, as part of protecting their critical infrastructure, to put measures in place to be able to track what is happening within their networks. This also applies to cross-border or supranational networks, where countries have been encouraged to enter into bilateral or trilateral cooperation agreements to manage infrastructure that crosses borders and is shared by multiple countries. In this case, there is obviously economic loss because of this incident, and that directly affects a country because then it has to, in most cases, veriment resources that were meant for other projects towards addressing this particular incident. Societal breakdown. If people do not have access to energy, it tends to create strife within society. And so it is in the best interests of member states or countries to then take the necessary steps to protect their critical infrastructure. The assumption is not that all countries can do that, particularly in developing countries. Countries have very limited resources to be able to also dedicate towards this. And so the recommendations here or good practices that countries would work with members of private sector to protect their critical infrastructure. And as you're already aware, the private sector is the major owner and operator of critical infrastructure, but the state's role is to be able to provide a conducive environment by passing the necessary and relevant policies towards protecting this infrastructure. And so these are of the 11 applicable norms of responsible state behavior, which are voluntary. These are what applies in this particular instance. I've already referred to the fact that there is an expectation for member states to protect their critical infrastructure by designating it in the relevant documents, but as well as that countries are expected to cooperate and assist each other when it comes to protection of that critical infrastructure. But we saw from the scenario that there is an adversary. And so there's also a norm that refers to cooperation to prevent the criminal and terrorist use of ICTs. Now, we don't know the full profile of the adversary, but chances are it is a criminal act to target the energy grid of any country. And so it would be a crime in several countries' jurisdictions. And so countries should take the necessary steps to then prosecute that crime. But then there's also Norm 13C, which I also referred to, that countries should not knowingly allow that territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts. And so if a country from which the adversary group is operating is notified that the attack is coming from its territory, there is an expectation for that country to take the necessary steps to stop that particular incident. And then we move to scenario 2. In this one, again, we still have AI, which has tricked the system into behaving differently than it is intended. The particular target is an immigration infrastructure, which is supposed to evaluate requests to enter the particular country. However, here what happens is Nation A wanted to destabilize Nation B, and therefore probed into its AI system, learned the general parameters that have been set, with the goal of increasing the number of people with criminal or terrorist backgrounds. And so the AI system or the immigration system was meant to then, upon receiving application, weed out those applications of people with criminal or terrorist background to be considered separately. But then a country then decided that it would actually make it work the other way. And so the immigration system would actually green light people with criminal or terrorist background, and then would actually decline people without this background. The consequence, because country B did not realize this early enough, was that there was a steady rise in crime. But there was also a rise in resentment among the population. And then there were calls for reviewing the assessment because of its unbiased nature. But we all know that that is not what that country had aimed to do. And so here again, immigration is considered critical infrastructure, a critical service rather, in most countries because of the particular role that it plays. And so when a country deliberately destabilizes this particular system, then there are also several norms that countries have agreed to. Number one also being that no country should deliberately undertake to destabilize another country's critical infrastructure or critical information infrastructure, or even the services related to that infrastructure that provide public services to people. The challenge here, of course, is how do you maintain public safety, but how do you also sufficiently secure AI tools? Because there is no particular technology which countries believe will continuously play a big role within their cybersecurity networks. AI has come as a big one. However, the norms as they currently exist are technology agnostic, and so they were not intended to refer to particular technologies. And so as we look at the norm on protecting critical infrastructure, we take it that even as technology evolves, the same rule applies. And so countries should be putting in place the necessary policies and regulations, regardless of which technology they're referring to. So again, as I've said, these norms also apply to these countries. But then one that is interesting here is norm 13B. When you know that a particular country, or you think that a particular malicious incident is coming from a particular country, it can be very easy or tempting to then say, I know that it is country so-and-so. But because of the almost irreparable harm that that can do, if those assertions are not sufficiently proven, the norms rather encourage that a state considers all relevant information, including the larger context of the event, before it can attribute a particular incident to a particular country. And this is a three-step process that countries are currently using. So the first one is the technical level. Can a country technically prove that a particular incident originated from country X's jurisdiction? A country can easily say yes, but without going to the second layer and third layer, it cannot be sure. And I revert you back to that table of state involvement. You can't be sure whether it was state facilitated, state led, state tolerated, or state sponsored. And so we cannot just take those technical parameters to be enough for us to say that country X is responsible. The second layer of this is the legal layer. Have any laws actually been violated? And this is where a country passing the necessary laws and legislation is so important, because if there is no law that criminalizes that particular act, then it becomes very difficult then to act, even if it is to the non-state perpetrators, in this case, criminals or terrorist groups. And then there is the third layer, which usually then makes it to the headlines, which is just a political decision to either attribute publicly or privately. And so when we've seen in the headlines a particular country saying they know that country X was responsible for a malicious cyber incident, a political decision has been made there to make that attribution public. But so many attributions happen privately, where countries talk to each other through diplomatic channels, about incidents, and those never make it into the headlines. And so all we have are just the tactics and techniques that a lot of other cybersecurity incident trackers would have seen. But then we don't actually know if there was any attribution to a particular country or if it was just a criminal perpetrator responsible. But then here it also comes to the issue of supply chain of AI tools, and this is Norm 13I. So as part of good cybersecurity practice anyway, and especially also with regards to state use or country use of these ICT products, there is this norm that then says that states should take reasonable steps to ensure the integrity of supply chain so that end users can have confidence in the security of ICT products. And states should seek to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT tools and techniques and the use of harmful hidden functions. So you'd be familiar with how certain countries, through an engagement with private developers, would have requested backdoors. This particular norm says countries should not be asking developers to develop such backdoors for them. The second one is sometimes when there are harmful hidden functions that a country identifies, it does not share that, and instead it falls in the wrong hands and it proliferates. That is another caution that these rules encourage states to not participate in. But then there's the supply chain issue. There have been a lot of incidents where there's been supply chain integrity issues, and AI tools are another one of those. And so even though these norms will not list out all the emerging technology existing and ones that will be created in the future, the supply chain is very important. And that's why secure by design or security by design is also part of what countries are encouraged to take into consideration. And the way that they do this is through their vendor management systems, but by also creating policies and regulations for testing ICT tools before they are then circulated within the broader public service. And then scenario 3 is also a popular one, which is political manipulation. And this is an example of AI-powered mass disinformation, which skewed election preferences in a particular direction. This can also apply to the use of synthetic media or deepfakes, where a country deliberately then uses ICT tools to impact or affect the internal political environment of another country. And here the target is usually the population when it comes to these mass disinformation campaigns, or politicians, either during election cycles or even by using deepfakes. And the consequence of this is that there will be loss in reputation of the candidates or the politicians. There will be loss of trust in the electoral and democratic systems. And these could also include referendums or plebiscites, not just elections. And it also leads to deep divisions within society. And so here, what we see is that there was a coordinated campaign of deepfake videos accompanied by other deepfake media published during election period, showing one politician standing for elections taking a very unpopular position and retracting on former positions, stuttering or answering questions incorrectly. Just a campaign to really affect the trust of the population during a democratic process. And again, this is the use of ICT tools. The AI is just being used to propagate as well as to make it more difficult, but also intense. And so here again, there are rules and principles that countries should not participate in this kind of behavior. And the specific norm here that is referred to is that countries should cooperate in developing and applying measures to increase stability and security in the use of ICTs, and to prevent ICT practices that are acknowledged to be harmful or that may pose threats to international peace and security. So all of these scenarios have been to show that even though they may look separate, this is just another deep fake that you may see, or just another misinformation campaign. And then the other one can just look like another system has been manipulated, and a country is talking about lack of access to a particular service for the public. And then this can look like just another energy grid that has been attacked, water, telecommunications. Sometimes it is just a criminal perpetrator, but sometimes it is a perpetrator that has links to a state, and therefore then it is not the regular rules and legislation of a country that apply, but rather the norms of responsible state behavior, which then ask countries to behave in a particular way that does not impact or badly impact international peace and security. And so in conclusion, I want to say that these threats are real. They are constantly evolving, but they can be managed. And one of the most important things that we encourage countries to then pass are the cybersecurity strategies, because in these cybersecurity strategies, they can then designate the critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure. They can then designate focal points. So in cases of cross-border high impact cybersecurity incidents, countries should be able to know who to call beyond the computer emergency response teams and the cyber security incident response teams. Countries have also designated focal points at the diplomatic as well as legal level. And this particular directory is not managed by the Forum on Incident Response, for instance, but is directly managed by the United Nations. And this is where it's important to then that we know who these focal points are, or rather the offices that they occupy, so that other countries are able then to make the call in case of such incidents. But in these national cybersecurity strategies, and if you are interested, I would ask you to have a look. There are also sections that refer to international engagement in cybersecurity strategies. And this is where this particular pillar of cybersecurity policy falls. It falls under the international engagement because it has to do with how that particular country is going to engage with bodies like the UN, the African Union, and other multilateral bodies with regards to cybersecurity discussions. Oh yes, and including the International Telecommunications Union, which then has the Cybersecurity Index. But what you also find in cybersecurity strategies are the capacity building element. In the context of developing regions and countries, and specifically Africa, a lot of countries have said that even though they are aware of the importance of having instruments like cybersecurity strategies and setting up computer emergency response teams and designating focal points, they just do not have the necessary capacity to deal with everything that this particular pillar then presents. And this is where then it is important then that countries survey their needs in terms of cybersecurity. Is it a workforce issue? Is it a policy issue? Is it a technical issue? Is it an understanding of the threat landscape? So does the country have the necessary tools to know what is happening within its networks and how what is happening outside impacts their national security and their networks. And capacity building, because it's such a big issue, there are a lot of UN institutions as well as other multilateral institutions that offer countries this kind of capacity building. This program, for instance, has been included in what the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group has put together as very useful capacity building initiatives aimed at increasing and contributing to a skilled workforce. And then another element that is very useful as you go through the cybersecurity strategies is the international context, but also the national and regional. So nationally, a country may say it is looking at and focused on high cybercriminal activity, where the perpetrator is non-state actors, activist groups, or lone rangers or lone wolves that then undertake these malicious ICT incidents for various purposes. It could be financial, it could be psychological, but then there's the regional context. And this is where then taking into consideration that these ICT tools are cross-border and run across multiple countries, then it means that an ICT incident in one country could have cross-border effects on another country. And so even though nationally, you may assess your country and say that you are only concerned with or primarily concerned with cybercrime, you will find that if your neighboring country or a country in your region is then a victim of a malicious ICT incident from another country, then it might affect the very ICT infrastructure that you share. But then there's also the international context. And to date, we know and have seen that ICT tools have been used preceding armed conflict or in the context of existing armed conflict. And so that is an international context that also countries, respective of which regions they are in, cannot ignore, because those incidents can also affect shared infrastructure. So an incident that may affect a national grid in one country may easily cascade and then affect national grids of other countries that then provide essential services to a country in Africa. And so because there is no way, and as we all know, that these ICT tools cannot just be restricted to particular national borders, it is then important that as we look at cybersecurity strategies overall, they are holistic to include these three dimensions as well. And then just as a wrap up, there are a couple of headlines that have already been referred to just this week. And some of those headlines include the use of ICT tools for hacking in the current geopolitical circumstances in the Middle East. That is use of ICT tools. It was malicious and targeted at the critical infrastructure, which had to do with surveillance of that country. We've also seen headlines that have also referred to critical vulnerabilities that have fallen in the wrong hands, because as countries stockpile vulnerabilities to use for strategic purposes, sometimes non-state actors are monitoring the same networks and then use those vulnerabilities that were meant for national security to then sell them on the open black market, to then continue to perpetrate other crimes. But there are also incidents where national institutions like parliament websites or other websites providing public services have also been defaced, and there have been links to other states. That is another example of behavior that the UN discussions are encouraging states to not participate in. And so as you see, these are the same cybersecurity principles that you would have been exposed to or are familiar with, which have to do with protecting the infrastructure, taking the necessary steps, protecting and paying attention to the supply chain, taking care of those vulnerabilities to ensure that they do not fall in the wrong hands, reporting those vulnerabilities. But then there's also an important one that also specifically applies to countries, which is that as countries pass or develop their cybersecurity policies, they also have to take into consideration human rights, so that those policies do not violate the international human rights laws, but also the human rights statutes and constitutions of those particular countries. And so I will stop here so that we can have some time for questions as well as reflect on this particular area of cybersecurity. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you very much for the insightful lecture. There are a number of questions, so I've tried to arrange them so they flow nicely. Seeing you were mentioning the use of ICT tools in the Middle East, a question is, does that actually also go against the UN agreements, or do those agreements not cover wartime?
Should I do a question answer, or should we take a round?
It's up to you. If you want to take a round, there are a few follow-ups as well.
Okay, let me take this one separately because this is a very specific one. So these norms of responsible state behavior, when they were created and developed, they were created for peacetime. And so these particular actions or scenarios that I have outlined are considered to be below the threshold of war. And because there is no international convention on cybersecurity, what we do have is international law, international humanitarian law. And so in the context of an ongoing armed conflict, what then applies is international humanitarian law. And countries have agreed that these rules also apply there. And so what that means in practical terms is that if countries are using ICT tools in armed conflict, then the same rules that apply to conventional tools, such as the need to be able to distinguish between civilian and military targets, applies. So if it is malware or targeting energy or water grid, there should be a distinction between critical infrastructure that is civilian use as well as legitimate military targets. The same thing applies to critical infrastructure such as health, which has been a big victim in these kinds of incidents. If a health facility is targeted, it is primarily for civilian use. And so with regards to IHL principles around proportionality, as well as and distinguishing, there will be consequences in terms of whether that country adhered to those particular principles. So you'll hear a lot of the times in the headlines, reference being made to this is a violation of international law, this is a violation of international law. And with regards to ICT tools, it applies the same way it would apply to conventional use, boots on the ground. It is a violation of international humanitarian law to indiscriminately use ICT tools and target civilian infrastructure or critical infrastructure that provides services for the public, including health, education, water, electricity. And so take that and apply it to any other armed conflict or conflict situation that is happening in the world, the same rules will apply.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I think most of the questions can be probably answered individually. So
Oh,
this one is also probably very specific. Do you think that collective sanctions against a suspected country could actually escalate the cyber conflict rather than deter it?
love this question. I'm actually going to share a list of cyber policy tools that I use in my work, and it includes things like the US OFAC sanctions list, which I think is a useful resource, but also the EU cyber diplomacy toolkit. So sanctions have proved it's a mixed bag, especially because not a lot of countries have used this particular way of dealing with adversaries or ICT or malicious ICT perpetrators. Sanctions, at the heart of them, what we know are the big three. Economic sanctions, which is listing particular entities or individuals from a country that is suspected of being behind facilitating funding or even supporting particular adversarial groups or using their own national intelligence institutions. And then you have arms embargoes, which can be very tricky in the situation of ICT tools because a lot of tools are commercially available, including ransomware as a business or even cyber intrusion tools, malware. All of these are commercially available and largely broadly available. So that's the challenge with that particular use of sanctions because the access or barrier is also so low. And then we then of course then have restrictions on travel. And so these tools can be useful if the countries are able to then identify the exact nodal point at which these malicious ICT incidents are taking place. And that's where it becomes tricky because to draw a straight line between an adversary or an adversary group that is being used by a particular country can be very difficult. But if it is identified, asset freezes can be useful in that then there aren't funds that are being used for those particular campaigns, but also access to particular technology, which is also a very controversial issue in the UN discussions, that sanctions can also limit access to very necessary technology to counter ICT incidents. But at the same time, some countries feel that it is very useful to then address those adversarial threats. But we remain to see the exact way in which sanctions can really put a chokehold, just because the access or the barrier is so low.
Yeah, thank you. So let's jump to concept of enforcement. As the cyber norms prohibit the destabilization of another country's critical infrastructure, what do you think is the biggest hurdle in enforcing this? And does the UN have some form of team or mechanism that can monitor member states regarding their cyber activities?
The short answer is no. The United Nations does not have a team that monitors this. And the other one is countries are expected to monitor each other or themselves. And so what we have are several different tools that then track cyber incidents and then categorize them depending on whether they think that this was from another state to another state or if this was just another cyber criminal group. The reason why there is no enforcement mechanism is that countries felt that ICT ICTs played such an important backbone role to the economies of different countries. And in order for countries to not, one, restrict innovation around technology, but also to not limit the use of ICTs for peaceful purposes, including for development, the regulation around technologies or developing enforcement measures seemed to run counter to those other responsibilities that countries have. And so countries are then expected to adhere to these norms because they make sense, because countries should not deliberately be targeting infrastructure of other countries without due regard to the national as well as regional and international security of that particular country. I know it's not a perfect system, but currently that is all we have. And then at the national level, countries can then, of course, have the prerogative to develop other measures. Sanctions are one of them, to then deal with malicious perpetrators, even if they are other states. There are ideas around including this within the ambit of the International Criminal Court. We're yet to see how that will work. But then there are also different ways in which countries are handling this. They've been particular stances or calls that targeting humanitarian organizations, for instance, should be something that countries should not do. And the expectation around enforcement is that that is something that then will be dealt with under the ambit of international human rights law and international criminal law. And so now those are really the only other ways that exist. And like other cybersecurity professionals, we use the publicly available or private incident trackers to see what is happening in the landscape, because also you will never get a country that will admit to being responsible for a malicious incident against another country. Thanks, Brett.
Okay, thank you. There have been actually quite a number of questions around artificial intelligence. So the main thrust is, are the current international legal frameworks and norms adequate currently, given the growth of AI being integrated into cyber operations, as well as along the lines of difficulty in attribution? Do you think that's going to make attribution more difficult, particularly if the false flags can maybe become a bit more convincing?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. False flag operations were difficult before AI. They are significantly more difficult with the use of AI tools. It's completely changed the way cybersecurity defenders look at the threat landscape, as well as the tools that they had at their disposal. And every time we know that cybersecurity defenders find ways of using AI to also propagate defending mechanisms, then at the same time, the offenders or the perpetrators are doing it just as quickly. And so it is a moving needle. At the international level, AI has been broken up, into different streams. So within the cyber discussions, we are looking at how to help countries understand how AI is making that landscape significantly more difficult by understanding what is the new thing in the AI that is making that particular cyber incident more difficult, as well as giving capacity building to those same countries then to see how to use AI for their defenses. And a lot of countries have found that very useful. But at the same time, AI is also being used in different areas as well. It's being used in the military domain, where different ICT tools are also being developed for authentic purposes. And so it's like everything else that we know on technology, policy is lagging behind, but it isn't a vacuum. There are several pieces of international policy and regulation here and there that are being used within the human rights area. There have been moratoriums that have been placed on particular technologies, including how AI is being incorporated into them. There are also areas where things like the commercially available cyber intrusion tools and the way in which AI is being incorporated into them are also being addressed. The other big challenge from a couple of years ago, and I think it's still continuing, was ransomware. Ransomware was difficult before AI. It is significantly more difficult with AI. But there are a lot of initiatives that are being developed to help countries deal with that. Again, there is no easy answer, and it's even more difficult for countries that then have to manage this alongside long existing challenges that they already have, even outside of the cyber domain. But what as the UN and member states are discussing is just this need for more awareness of what is happening across the different networks to understand what the landscape actually looks like beyond the hype, but also to know what to prepare for. So AI is one of those that is taking up a lot of time of member states, but there's also post-quantum encryption, which countries are also concerned about. And then there are also other threats that countries are consistently dealing with. Again, the importance of policy and regulation, at least within the national jurisdictions, does help.
Thank you. We are pretty much at time, but I think there is a important question just to finish off.
Okay.
It seems like Africa is a way behind some other countries in terms of cybersecurity strategies. So the question is, how can the continent catch up with the rest of the world in protecting its digital sovereignty against other, maybe you can call them cyber powers?
That is a very good question. And yes, there are countries on the continent that don't have up-to-date national cybersecurity strategies or frameworks. Some have them, but they are a far cry from what the current landscape and international context looks like. I don't think the goal or what countries are thinking about is catching up to other countries in terms of that, but rather it is being agile and responsive to the threats as they come. And so the key here is to, and we do this within the discussions, encourage public-private partnerships. It is very difficult for countries to have nationally within themselves all the capabilities that are needed to deal with the cyber threats that are coming their way. And these partnerships with private sector are very important. And that is one thing that we also encourage very much. The other one is to also survey the needs. Where are the gaps within the capabilities that the country has? Do you have a cybersecurity emergency response team? If not, what's the plan? Can you get it from someone else? Is there someone providing the service to help you develop it? So we first have to know what the needs and the gaps are, and then start exploring the different relationships and partnerships to be able to deal with that. Sometimes it can be done in a framework quickly so that we can get the ball rolling and deploy the necessary tools. Sometimes it is a pre-existing strategy that just needs to be updated, but we can work within that particular strategy. And so that is the real goal now, to get countries resilient enough, because we know that they cannot prevent all threats, but it is to increase the cyber resilience, to help them have the capabilities to manage and respond to those cyber incidents, not if, but when they do happen.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I think we need to end it here. Thank you so much for the presentation and your insights. There are still questions coming in, so I have requested that they be copied. And if you wish to view them or engage with them later, we'll get a copy to you. Thank you so much again. It's been a very interactive and good audience, and your insights are greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for engaging. I will share the resources, and you have my contact details, and you can go to your website to reach out to anyone, and we will greatly engage. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.